Let me just start with the two sort of very small caveats. One is I'm not a sociologist, as some of you might know. So this is actually my first foray into serious sociology. Yeah? I do know a lot of sociologists. I'm married to one, so I guess that might help. But I am working with two sociologists. One of them is here. Shruti Majumdar is my co-author on this, and she's sitting right here. And the other one is Paramita Sanyal. So anyway, plunging right in. So I'm actually, the other second thing is that this is preliminary work. It's actually hot off the press. We just finished it 2-3 months ago, the first draft. We're looking to revise it. So any suggestions, comments would be greatly appreciated. So please bear with me if there are a few, unpolished parts, but that's sort of the point. Okay. Now, the basic question is, how can an anti-poverty intervention induce cultural change of a kind that we want? Yeah. And the context is Bihar, and the structure of the presentation is I'm going to be talking about this project, Jeevika, and give you some sense. Hey, Prerna, come. Give you a sense of the project research and timeline, findings from a survey that we did there, go over some of the methodologies of the quantitative work, the analysis, and then some theoretical speculations. Yeah. This is, of course, a map of Bihar, but also gives you a sense of where our field sites are, which is in Muzaffarpur district and Madhubani district. And I don't have to explain this to this audience. It's oppressively patriarchal and extremely hierarchical with caste. But interestingly, you may not know this, has the lowest Gini coefficient of any state in India. Yeah? That's because it's poor. So, okay. Again, it's a brief history of the politics of Bihar, which is important for our paper. 1990s, Lalu Prasad Yadav, and the era of caste-based politics. And in 2005, Nitish Kumar wins his first round as chief minister and comes with an explicit mandate, two kinds of mandates. One is the explicit mandate of development, but women's empowerment being very, very important in his campaign and his manifesto. And then, of course, he starts that bicycle program for schoolgirls and Jeevika, which is what we're talking about, which is the Women's Livelihoods Project. Further consolidates power in 2011 election in coalition with the BJP. In 2006, Jeevika is introduced as Nitish's flagship anti-poverty program, and the World Bank enters Bihar for the first time. Yeah, this is all actually quite central to what we see going on here. What is Jeevika? What are livelihoods projects in general? This is important to know because it's sort of the structure in which we build our things. This is, of course, nothing to do with my research, but it is the topic of our research. A livelihoods project is basically a network of self-help groups, women's self-help groups. You start with a group of between 7 to 12 women. You form these groups, 10 to 15 per village. These groups are formed around the basis of microcredit and savings, but they're really about consolidating women's networks. Each group elects a woman president, a chairperson, a bookkeeper, a treasurer. The chairwomen of all these groups forms the village organization. That village organization is then federated into a block organization, to a district organization. So you essentially have this hugely interlinked network of women's groups, yeah, in the project areas. That's what's called the core intervention. Then you have what are called vertical interventions on top of that core intervention, where these women's groups act sort of as a network, as a highway, and you roll out various development interventions for income generation, for nutrition, all kinds of stuff, domestic violence. And facilitators are very key to this because they are the lowest level project staff who go down to the lowest level and work with these villages to form these groups, to work with these women's groups, to form these groups, help them through the process, and are the interface of the project with the women's groups. So they're kind of the key actors in our narrative as well. Now, a brief sense of the timeline of the project and of our research. The project began, as I said, in 2006. With about 4 lakh women targeted at that point and enrolled in these self-help groups. Phase 2 began in 2011, where the number of women was doubled to 800,000. Phase 3 began last year with 3 million, and the final phase will cover the entire state. We came in 2011. At this point, one of our mandates was to sort of assess the impact of the 2006 intervention, the 5 years of intervention in 2006 to 2011 in phase 1 of the project. Not in the expansion phase, but in phase 1. And we also started our qualitative work at that time, as well as our quantitative work. So we'll be talking about two things in this particular presentation. One is the quantitative assessment of phase 1, looking backwards, and then of the qualitative work that started then. Yeah. Okay, if there are any clarifying questions in the middle of what I'm saying, for whatever reason, please raise your hands. I'm very happy to answer it. There's plenty of time. Yeah. Now, I'm going to go a bit into the quantitative analysis very briefly. If you could raise your hands, if any of you is a trained PhD economist, please raise your hand. One person. Okay, good. All right. So let me just do this in a very simple way. It's actually, the point of this is quite simple. What we're using, and this is important to the qualitative work, so I want to spend some time on it. What we're doing is we're assessing the impact of the project backwards. It's a retrospective evaluation, right? So we're looking for what happened to the project between 2006 and 2011 in phase one, the phase one district, the phase one blocks of the phase one districts. And what you then do, how you do this is basically you first generate a sample that creates treatment and control groups, which are matched on the basis of statistical observations, of statistical data. Okay? So in a sense, you're creating statistical clones that are one set of which have received the project, the other set of which is very similar to those that receive the project but are the control groups. Okay? The second thing you're doing, so that's a sampling process. The second thing you're doing, and of course you're sampling those villages, and then you're sampling at random households within those villages that you're interviewing. And the second thing you're doing is that when you're going and doing your surveys, you're going back in time and asking what are the changes that happened between 2006 and 2011. So that's the nature of the outcome data we have. It has many limitations, but that was the option available to us given that we came in 2011 to look backwards. Yeah? And then you do what is known as the difference in difference analysis, and you get your results. Now, I'm not going to go through that. That's a propensity score regression. Prerna might be interested, but nobody else. All right, let's go down here. Now, this tells you how good the data were. These are the graphs that sort of show you the statistical clones that we found. And you find that the graphs are very similar to each other except the green parts, which you basically trim out, and you focus on the red and the blue, which are the treated and the untreated households in those villages, and you see that they're very, very similar. So in that sense, the matching methodology worked. Okay. Now, this is the relevant graph table you need to think about for the qualitative, is that using this method, this methodology of retrospective PSM matched methods, as we call it, we saw a huge impact. Okay. Savings rates in these households went up by 300% because of the project. The percent of households with high-cost loans went down by 43%. The amount borrowed went down by 46% from new loans. Yeah, and look at women's empowerment. Different indicators of women's empowerment. Whether women visited panchayat meetings went up by more than 500%, more than fivefold. Whether women went on their own to visit a local shop went up by 22%. Visit the PDS for 59%. Visit the health center 44%. Visit a relative 37%. Provide decisions on children's education 37%. Report having an opinion on politics, 332%. This paper was published in World Development by somebody who works for me, Upmanyu Datta, who did the study. Yeah?
Sorry, this is 2 points in time, 2006 and 2011?
Well, the retrospective questions were going 3 years back, but yeah, when you could think of it that way, yeah. But it's sort of 2 points in time and treatment control. Therefore, first difference minus second difference. Yeah.
And so, you're asking them basically that about 3 years ago, how often did you attend a panchayat?
Sort of, yeah.
And then you're saying how often do you attend a panchayat? And you did the same with the treatment and control.
Exactly.
And you have no baseline survey data even for the... So it's all based on just recollection.
It's all based on recollection. Yeah, it's all based on recollection, and so yeah, it has that limitation.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it is what it is, but there's no reason to expect that on all of these variables you'll see these huge impacts, and we do. Yeah. Now.
Sorry. The savings data, that's also from their own recollection.
Their own recollection.
Any documentation of that?
No. It's documentation from themselves, right? And so this is all retrospective data. This is all retrospective data. It's very much like any other household survey we ask for savings, except we're going in 2 points in time. One in the past, one in the current period. Yeah? Okay, I don't get into this too much because it is what it is. I just wanted to use this as a way of the entry point into the qualitative work. Yeah, and I can also, if you wish, talk about the randomized trial we're doing on these things now. That's an entirely different story. Yeah. Okay, so the question then is, given that we're finding these huge impacts in the quantitative retrospective evaluation, to use the qualitative data to understand where did this come from. Firstly, to have a triangulation and verify, in fact, if this is true. But secondly, that you ask where did it come from. Okay, so what we did is that we took a subset of the PSM match sample, treatment and control villages, and we kind of let me go through that methodology a little bit because that's important. we selected the best paired treatment and control matches from the quantitative survey, yeah, the best paired. And then using those scores, there were a choice of about 3 villages that could have been matched. So then we did a week-long exercise of visiting these villages, understanding their socioeconomic conditions, their social structures, and then paired them out with visual observation to the extent that we got very, very close matches in the treatment and control. Yeah, that was our qualitative sample. At the end, data was collected from 6 villages, 2 villages from phase 1, which is going backwards. Yeah, because phase 1 got its intervention started the intervention in 2006, we're coming in 5 years later. 2 villages from phase 2, which at that point were just starting the intervention. They're brand new. At this point, there's nothing going on before we went there. And 2 villages are pure controls where Jeevika had not even entered. Okay, so we're looking. The qualitative sample is 6 villages.
And so it's like 3 pairs.
I'll come. You'll see that in a second. Yeah. So yeah, but 6 villages. Yeah, and you can see here that they're all paired in the sense that it's not a pair but a triplet. Yeah, they're 2 triplets is the way you want to think about it. Yeah. So 2 control villages, we're tracking organic changes, nothing to do with the project. 2 phase 2 villages where we're tracking short-term changes induced by Jeevika from 2011 onwards. 2 phase 1 villages, we're looking at durable long-term change. Yeah. And what the point to make here is that in the qualitative, yes, we're coming in 2011. That's where the quantitative work stops for the retrospective, but that's where our qualitative work begins. We have visited these villages from 2011 to 2015 on a regular basis. So we're tracking them over time. We're going backwards, but then tracking them forward from that point as well. And let me go to the sample. That comes later. Okay. So I'll come to the nature of the data collection in a second. But just to get a sense of how well these villages are matched on the basis of the qualitative data, you basically have in these triplets almost identical caste structures. Yeah. So in Madhubani district, dominant caste is Brahmin, also the landlords, as you might expect, all the Jhas. The middle castes are Yadavs, Mandals, Hajams, lower castes are Rams and Mushahers. In Muzaffarpur, 3 villages, dominant castes are Chaudhries or Rajputs, middle Ansari, Badhai, Paswan, lower are Rams, Sabzi Farosh, Pasi. Yeah. So those caste structures are very, very similar in each of those districts for each of those triplets. Yeah. Okay. Now the methodology is every 3 months, 5 qualitative researchers would visit every hamlet in each of these villages for a week, and interviews, and they were led by Shruti and to some extent by Paramita and me. So one of us was always there when these teams went in. PRA methods in the baseline at the beginning when they went in were done to get a preliminary understanding of the village political economy and social mapping. But then we did a whole bunch of interviews with joiners, non-joiners, husbands, with key stakeholders of different kinds, with Jeevika staff, a lot of participant observation of group meetings, trainings, workshops, mobilization drives. These 12 cycles of data are really an enormous data set. And for qualitative samples, enormous data set, 1,440 transcripts, 20 interviews in each round, FGDs. Interviews were recorded either in Hindi or Maithili and translated in English by the interviewers. We sampled in each round 120 joiners in phase 1, 120 joiners in phase 2 in each district, 48 non-joiners, people who chose not to go in, 24 husbands of joiners, 24 general informants, and 24 FGDs in each of these villages. So you can see this is a voluminous amount of qualitative data, yeah? And we're tracking this over time. So all of this then was sort of inductively coded in vivo, which is a qualitative analysis program, and sort of 6 sub-themes emerged as salient: physical mobility, husband's reaction to the women's participation, dignity of borrowing, information on village credit, perception of government, collectivization. And then to compare change across treatment and control, these 6 themes are systematically compared to what men and women said in controlled villages about similar themes. And then to look at the role of facilitation, we sort of looked at the participant observation of facilitated activities, and then did several interviews with them and with joiners, how is Jeevika responsible for the changes experienced? And 3 themes emerged as salient from the facilitated interviews, the idea of visualization, which I'll go through in a second, village-wide cooperation, and the project is a way of life. Okay, and I'll be talking about all these themes in a second. But I just want to go through the methodology. Is that clear, the methodology? Yeah? All right. So let's go to the findings. And let's firstly start with the control villages. And here, this is nothing very surprising. Anybody familiar with rural North India is going to know this. caste boundaries are very rigid. They constrain preferences. Mike Walton and I call constraint preferences some time ago. Going back to Bhumo's idea that hierarchy is sort of internalized, and Sanskritization is the modus operandi for upward mobility. In the public sphere, dominant castes dominate the panchayat system, and even in villages with reservations of lower caste, dominant castes call the shots via traditional panchayats and so on. But what was interesting was there's a sort of change going on, two sort of organic changes. One is enormous amounts about city migration, and when the migrants come back, they come with relatively progressive attitudes, and you can see that. And they also bring significant increases in income if you're a migrant household, and that also brings in sort of positive changes.
Are you going to show that down the line, this particular aspect, or this idea that migrants?
No, that's not going to be a focus, but I'm going to focus on the Jeevika effect, but we can talk about that later on if you're interested. Yeah. Okay. Now, looking at gendered practices, again, nothing very surprising in the control villages. Household decision making is dominated by men and in-laws. It's almost sort of stereotypical. Women's physical mobility is severely circumscribed. Women moving freely is seen as symptomatic of male deficiency. We document this overwhelmingly. And the public sphere and money lending is entirely a masculine activity. And restrictions are more stringent for women of a caste. And there's a quote: "Women from the Brahmin community will starve to death, but they will not step aside." I mean, it's classic Sanskritization. Yeah. Now, let's now get to how Jeevika works in the treatment villages, and it's sort of important to see this because it's partly where our story comes from. It's a hierarchical system like any government project. Going from the top down, you have a dedicated society that's run by a CEO. It's a World Bank project with the government of Bihar. Then you have state project management units. You have district management units. You have block implementation units with a block project manager. But at the village level, and that's where the facilitators work, they report to the block project manager. Those facilitators work with a set of villages called clusters. Those villages, in turn, each have community level workers, which are a cadre of community resource persons, bookkeepers, community mobilizers, typically recruited from within the village for the project. Yeah. So the facilitators are lowest level bureaucrat. They are recruiting people from within the village to sort of do the project, as it were. Yeah. But they are within a hierarchical bureaucratic structure. Right. Now, what are the steps of facilitation? What do these facilitators do when they do it well? And part of our story is to show you when they don't do it well as well. So when they do it well, what are they doing? They're sort of thinking very politically. They're thinking that they know what they're doing. They know that these are elite-dominated villages, upper caste-dominated villages. They incorporate that into how they work. They first do a thorough power analysis. They do a lot of informal information gathering. They examine caste dynamics. They look at elite structures, land use patterns, money lending practices, gender norms. They kind of do this basic sort of baseline work to understand how the village is put together. Yeah. Then they go about getting buy-in. So that's kind of basic analysis. Then they go and get in buy-in. That's a painstaking work of going to the elites, going to the village elders, going to the mukhya, going to the sarpanch, and going to the various landlords and explaining what they're about. And generally they come, and remember they're coming as a World Bank project, as Nitish Kumar's flagship program, bringing development into this village. That's their rhetoric. Okay, we're going to change this village. We're going to make this poverty disappear, and we're going to do it by forming women's groups, as they've done in all these states all over India. This is the first time this is coming to Bihar. And the interesting thing, and the project people will themselves tell you this, that cheap credit, and it's massively cheaper. It's about a fifth of the interest rate charged by the local moneylender that Jeevika offers. They said that cheap credit is sort of the bribe to get husbands to send their women, their wives, into these groups. But all the time they're trying to bring men into the picture. They're working with men to sort of get them into the picture. It's not just working with women. Yeah, it's trying to get complete buy-in from the entire village for their work. Yeah. And so and then again, it's not just doing it one time, it's an ongoing conversation. You're constantly working with elites, you're constantly working with networking with the power structures in the village to make sure that your project is protected. Enormous amount of social mapping of different kinds to recruit first movers, identify women who can be agents of change, who eventually turn to the eyes and ears of the community and help mobilize women, and use these sort of first movers to then mobilize other women. Yeah, so that's the first step, thinking politically, and that's sort of the power analysis. Second step, mobilizing the women. And very, very importantly, the facilitators, when they worked well, particularly in phase one, uh, were not there in a preachy way. They were sort of talking about let's work with you to make your lives better. Not that it wasn't sort of a typical government project thing. You participate in this, you get all these benefits. That wasn't generally the conversation. The conversation was let's find ways together of understanding how we make our lives better. Yeah. So it's sort of a co-produced discourse of empowerment, if that was partly what it's called, a co-produced discourse of livelihoods. And the people actually did it were first movers from each of these villages, recruited into the project, the bookkeepers and others, and women imported from Andhra Pradesh to work on these things. Of course, Andhra Pradesh has a long-standing history of self-help groups to mobilize women. But what was very interesting also was when they formed the women's groups in phase one in particular, they consciously decided to form them on the basis of class rather than caste. Yeah? So they would have these mixed caste groups and they would tell them, look, please leave your caste identity at the doorstep when you come into these rooms. We are all poor people here. That's our dominant identity, not the caste identity. It's the identity of being poor. Yeah? And then use a system of flip charts for encouraging women to share their own narratives of poverty. So that idea of poverty being the binding factor is reinforced. Yeah? Constantly, weekly meetings going on, constantly that theme is reinforced. And then within those, as the groups get more mature, you have these open discussions of gender norms and the constraints on participation that women have from different castes. And of course, the discourse of self-help and self-reliance, rather than cheap jobs or cheap credit. I mean, this idea of credit as a route towards self-reliance, rather than idea of credit as a route towards just finding cheap credit. That was very much how they did things. And participatory identification of the poor, getting women themselves to decide on who the poor women were, rather than coming with external criteria, like say the BPL card. The BPL was not the system used to select women to these groups, very much in terms of a community-based discourse for these things. Very, very painstaking, careful work. This is phase one. And then once those groups are formed, you start the rituals. Okay. You give women passbooks, you give them money boxes, you give every woman in the group some sort of task, and whatever those tasks are. And every week when the women get together, they sing sort of binding songs, these rituals of singing various kinds of songs, of various kinds of slogans that they develop. It's very sort of standard in microcredit projects, and they were certainly here as well. And then, of course, engaging head on every time there was some interference from the powers that be in the village. You engage with that. You don't run away from it or try to sort of push it aside. You actually engage with it and try to bring them in, incorporate them into the process. And repeated messaging, reiteration, and indoctrination, we call it street theater, flip charts, songs of different kinds. Jeevika treated as a way of life rather than as a project. Yeah, and as they sort of became adept at managing their credit and managing their savings, you start taking them to outside commercial banks, find them bank accounts. Remember, this is before this big push in bank accounts. This all happened in 2006. They're going off, finding their own bank accounts, bringing people over from there. The bank managers or the official from the bank comes to these groups, talks to them, tries to find ways of giving them credit for productive purposes. They go to the PDF shops together, start engaging with that. They start taking over the management of PDF shops when the PDF shops did not exist. They slowly start building the ability to use their collective power to start inducing change within the village, start engaging with the public sphere. Okay? Now, that was all phase one. But you compare the facilitation in phase one versus phase two, it's very telling. Remember, phase two, you've doubled the size of the project. There's enormous political pressure coming in to expand like crazy. A lot of good people, intrinsically motivated people, facilitators working in phase one, have moved on to other jobs. And you're now recruiting from the general pool. Yeah, this becomes a job rather than something that people do intrinsically. And in the process of co-production, it's more of a top-down process. So what you see is a huge difference in the quality of facilitation. The facilitators are less carefully recruited. There's an emphasis of quantity, getting more women into groups, the quality of the groups, and a very homogeneous and scripted discourse of poverty. You're not doing the careful groundwork necessary to get these groups together. You're kind of treating it as a targeted typical government project. Let's get this thing moving. You've got to move. It's going too slowly. Yeah, that's sort of where they're coming from. Now, what kinds of outcomes does facilitation lead to? Let's compare the outcomes as we see them in control areas, phase two villages and phase one villages. And this is, we've documented these extremely well in the qualitative work. Of course, you saw the results from the quantitative But none of this is from the quantitative. This is from the qualitative work. Firstly, in physical mobility. In control areas, we've said, being a woman and femininity associated with the domestic sphere. In phase 2, there is a bit of a change, is that women do want to participate in activities in Jeevika, but they're sort of seen as being not quite responsible civic people. Okay? In phase 1, with the recurring practice, with the formation of these groups and the maturity of these groups, it's okay for women to go into the public, to engage in the Gram Sabha, to sort of go to banks and etc. Yeah? And in terms of how the husbands react to this, in control areas, there's no change. In phase 2, because it's done in a rather hasty way, there's a bit of backlash from the husbands, including instances of domestic violence that we observed. And in phase 1, that resistance from the husbands is getting mitigated because of this idea of cheap credit, because they sort of see the women coming in and bringing benefits to their household, direct sort of consumption benefits, and also because the project has done the work of incorporating them into this co-production of discourse, and trying to get them as part of the process. Yeah.
Sorry, do we have a sense of the caste distribution of the women that joined in 1 and 2? And is it roughly
It's about the same, right, Shruti? It's about the same, yeah.
across Brahmins and the middle and
It's typically from the lower caste. There are a few Brahmin participants, but not so many.
So mostly from the lower and less as it was.
No, it's from the sort of what in Bihar, of course, you have the SC, the EBC, and the middle caste, that level, and then very few from the top caste. Yeah, but yes, it's focused on poor folks. Yeah,
This is a clarifying question because this is based on the qualitative data.
right.
If this was a kind of quantitative table, we'd have stars to show us that these are statistically significant
Right.
differences. But obviously, maybe this has to do with Nico's. I mean, how exactly do you get to this
Right.
point
So-
from that kind of rich qualitative?
Right.
vast
Well,
data that you
so
have?
being a primarily quantitative researcher, I get obsessed with these things. Yeah, and what our approach was is basically whatever we report here is observed again and again and again and again and again. Stuff that is so dominant in the data that we reported. Yeah. What we try to avoid, what we avoid doing at all costs, unless there's something interesting to say, is look at outliers. Yeah. Unless that outlier is interesting for its own purpose. But what I'm reporting here is stuff that is absolutely all over the place.
So it's like almost like a dominant trend from phase 2 villages.
Yeah.
A dominant trend from phase 1.
Yeah, and highly significant in statistical terms. I mean, I'm sure that we could show that.
The methodology of the two is vastly different, right? Because phase 1 is all recollection, and phase 2 you're actually tracking it
Well, no. So remember, yes and no. Yeah, and remember, in phase 2 we are also tracking them, but we're tracking them from a different starting point.
But you're
Right.
tracking them actually through that. It's not all recollection, whereas phase 1 is
No, phase 1, that's right. We're watching them from the start, but in phase 2 we're still tracking them for 3 years. We're tracking every day for 3 years, right? It's a long amount of tracking. So phase 1, we can sort of see whether all these changes that are reported in the retrospective is actually sustainable. We can actually see whether these things are happening. So therefore the phase, the quantitative work is definitely much stronger in terms of in phase 1, yeah, than the quantitative work. Yeah. Phase 2 is obviously starting from scratch, but then again we stop after 2 years. Yeah. So there are limitations in both the quality and in both phase 1 and phase 2. But I'm extraordinarily confident of what we're seeing in phase 1, because of the qualitative work, because it's sustained over the 3 years that we were watching them very closely. Yeah. Okay.
Just a quick thing.
भैया मुझे भी एक क्या दीजिए. Thank you.
Spatially, is phase 1 and phase 2 very distinct?
Sorry, spatially.
Spatially, or within the same district you have both phase 1 and
So remember, we're doing triplet matching. Yeah. So we were very, very careful to match the villages we look at qualitatively to be identical on most indicators. So they are very similar villages. They're in the same district, to some extent in the same block,
absolutely
always in the same block, and also with very similar socioeconomic indicators.
and the same number of villages.
Yeah. So,
1, 1, 1, 1,
so
1,
it's two triplets. It's two triplets.
1, 1, 1.
Yeah, it's two triplets.
No, but let me get this. So, is it the claim that within the same block you have both a phase 1 and a phase 2 village
Correct.
And
And a control.
and a control?
Yes.
And with Jeevika being present, you don't see any contamination across these cases.
No, and that's why, and again, I mean, I'm doing various things on this. I've been obsessed with the spillover issue. what is interesting about these projects is because they work with women's networks within the village. It's not like other people haven't heard that Jeevika is elsewhere. Yeah, but because it's a village network intervention, those networks do not spill over. Yeah, because they're bound within the self-help groups within each village. So there's not an issue that village is going to benefit from what Jeevika is doing here, except maybe peripherally. Yeah, and part of the ongoing organic changes that you might actually see as much on TV as you might see by talking to the person in the next village. So no, spillovers are minimal, actually.
But informational spillovers, obviously.
Informational spillovers are there, but those informational spillovers don't matter much because at the end it's the networks that matter.
I think they don't matter for your qualitative part, which is why I think they're solid here, but I do think they matter for your quantitative part.
It's possible, but still that would dampen the results, right? So if it happens, then fine, but we're still getting these huge results. I actually don't think they're observationally much of an issue, but still they would work against us to find results. Yeah?
Just to add to that, by the time we got to the end of our sort of qualitative, that's when women were kind of beginning to hear about Jeevika because it
After
was
3 years.
After 3 years. So it wasn't quite a thing in any of the two controls.
From the qualitative work, because I'm so confident spillovers are not an issue because we actually tracked that explicitly in the qualitative work. You didn't hear that stuff till the end. Yeah, so I should have said that. Yeah. Okay, so looking at economic outcomes, in control areas, the act of borrowing from women is sort of like an act like begging, yeah, and it's not a matter of pride. In phase 2, you borrow both from local money lenders and from the group, but there is a certain positive thing where women who borrow as part of a group feel that they have a certain more amount of control over that money, so it's more about authority over that money. In phase 1, there's this definite issue that borrowing from the SHG is less humiliating and has more dignity. Ability to obtain and loan information on these things, far better in phase 2. Their ability to, as good credit risks, their knowledge about information on credit networks, on credit access to credit is huge. In phase 2, they get a little bit of financial literacy and can calculate things like interest rates. And in control areas, it's the status quo. You have classic North Indian credit markets, usurious credit markets. Yeah? And political outcomes is where we see a lot of effect. I'm not going to repeat what we see in control areas, except to say that this issue of women's reservations, all we saw were perhaps proxy mukhyas. Yeah? We did not see any wonderfully empowered women running for panchayat elections. In phase 2, you see a certain beginning of aspirations for women to run for elections. You see that women are using the SHG to solve sort of some issues on a case-by-case basis. Women are beginning to talk about the necessity of bringing change in SHGs. In phase 1, they're running for election, they're participating in Aam Sabhas and Gram Sabhas, they're arbitrating themselves, taking over PDS shops, they're fighting corruption in NREJ, they're doing all kinds of amazing things. I remember Shruti came into this project a little late, and she went to the field and came back and I said, do you see changes? And she said, hell yeah. So it was like, it's palpable when you visit it. And if you go there now, you'll see the same thing, to see the changes that have happened in phase 1. Yeah? How did this change come about is sort of what I want to talk about a little bit now. Now, remember, Jeevika is not just about credit. It's also about the power of groups, the power of community, the power of women's community. And you're giving that power of community economic authority by giving them access to physical resources, cheaper credit than men have, for instance. So that itself, in a situation where women will not even take their husband's name, to have your own bank account, your own passbook, the ability to, for the first time, count cash, the ability to pass around money going from one woman's hand to another, where you trust a bookkeeper to make sure that money is kept safe. This is tremendously empowering. Create and symbolic resources, creating an alternate identity outside the nexus of caste and patriarchy, untethered by caste, marriage, and family, because you're coming to these groups where men are sort of not allowed. Yeah? And it's a safe space. And often it's done in public, in the open, but nobody comes. It's not like surveys that we do when you sort of do a focus group where everybody shows up. We've been to many of these groups, innumerable many of them. Nobody shows up except the group themselves. Yeah? And then, importantly, as time goes by, you're creating an institutional network. The village organization becomes, over time, a very, very, very powerful organization. Yeah? and gets into competition and dialogue with the panchayat and with traditional power structures. Yeah? You have SHG as alternate institutional environments, the village organizations, and the cluster level federations. And of course, all of them have this powerful access to credit, cheap credit, and you're undercutting the money lenders as a result. Yeah. So, and there's again quote from this: Nitish has turned women into men. So, to sort of slowly move towards a conclusion here, how did this durable change come about? You're really looking at competing frames, the frames of caste and patriarchy versus the frame of development. Yeah? And that frame is coming, that competing frame is coming with an enormous amount of power because they've just won a major election. Yeah? So you have the central government completely supporting the local social movement that's taking place, that's empowering women, if you want to call it that. Yeah? What Jeevika is doing in phase one is creating a sort of social movement in cahoots with the chief minister, who's the most powerful man in the state. Yeah? So they come in with a very powerful competing narrative and this bridging of symbolic boundaries by moving away from a rhetoric of caste in these groups to a rhetoric of poverty. Yeah? And then, of course, the new repertoires, the new rituals that are a substitute for the traditional repertoires and traditional rituals of women, which are completely new. Yeah? And all have extremely empowering messages. This is what you hear when you go to the group. Every week you hear, women can do anything. Women are the solidarity in women. You know, we can change the world. We can do anything we want. This gets reiterated week after week after week after week, and slowly things actually start changing. You know, so in terms of the theory of cultural change, I mean, this is quick change. It can happen if it's done right. Yeah, and you know. What women start beginning to do over time in phase one villages is that they sort of get a new set of discursive tools that they can use to fight for various types of benefits that they might seek by knowing how to seek political opportunities. They kind of learn what a political opportunity is, yeah, over time, understanding that this is how we can fight elections. This is what the budget is. The panchayat budget is got this space that we can get access to. We can take over the PDS shop because the PDS owner is, you know, not there anymore. We can make a petition to the government and take it over. So this idea of a sandwich that I've talked about in previous work and others have as well, that participatory change cannot happen on its own. It's just a bottom-up process. It has to be a sandwich where the top is supporting the bottom. That's very central here. And this idea of competing frames, it changes the mental model of how women function in these villages, at least for women to participate in Jeevika, function in these villages. And as a consequence of all of this, you know, I mean, it's a classic stuff. And these pictures actually highlighted. This is a picture from a control village, the one in the bottom left, where one of our interviewers is talking to a woman who's not only behind Parda, she's actually behind the door. He doesn't even get a chance. And here, she's having a perfectly normal one-on-one conversation with this guy. Completely in the open, and that really characterizes what we saw this project do, yeah, in phase one. Now, I'm happy to talk about phase two, which I've not talked about as much, but it's not as happy a story. Yeah? Okay, now let me stop there. Shruti and I are both here to answer your questions.